Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. We're recording this podcast and this series of podcasts from Burleson, Texas at Burleson Bible Church. I'm here to speak at a Bible conference sponsored by Versity and Colorado Biblical University. The conference is on the Apostle Paul's epistle to the church in Rome. So this conference provides a great opportunity to record a series of podcasts on the same subject, the book of Romans. And to do so, I have several friends and scholars that have joined me for these episodes who are also here at Burleson Bible Church to speak at this conference. My first guest is Pastor Gary Armstrong. Pastor Armstrong is the senior pastor at Burleson Bible Church in Burleson, Texas, and has pastored for 21 years. He's a graduate of the Word of Life Bible Institute. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Studies from Appalachian Bible College and a Master's in Biblical Studies from Piedmont International University. He has done additional graduate studies at Grace School of Theology. My second guest is Dr. Christopher Cohn. Dr. Cohn is the president and CEO of Versity and Colorado Biblical University. Prior to this, he served at several different Christian institutions of higher education, including as the president of Calvary University, the president of Tyndale Theological Seminary, and the chief academic officer at Southern California Seminary. He has 3 earned doctorates and is the author and editor of several books on theology and hermeneutics. His most recent book is entitled Authentic Justice. My third guest is Professor John Oglesby. Professor Oglesby is the Executive Vice President of Versity University and Executive Vice President of Colorado Biblical University. He has a master's degree in Bible and Theology and is working on his Doctor of Education in Transformative Learning and Leadership. My fourth guest is Dr. Steve Sperlin. Dr. Sperlin is the teaching pastor of Cornerstone Bible Church. He has served in various pastoral roles for a total of 17 years. In addition to his pastoral responsibilities, he is a professor for Versity University and Colorado Biblical University. He has a master's degree in theological studies, and he has 2 earned doctorates, one in theological studies and another in apologetics and theology. Gentlemen, welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. Well, I am very much looking forward to our conversation in today's episode and this series of episodes. We will be discussing the Biblical Theology of Romans, and this builds upon our program last week as we discussed, compared, contrasted biblical theology to historical theology and systematic theology. This week we'll discuss revelation and wrath. Next week we'll discuss the importance of the doctrine of justification. The week after we will discuss the subject of sanctification. And in our final episode in this series, we'll discuss God's plan and purpose for Israel, the restoration of Israel. Well, Dr. Cohn, in the first 2 chapters of Romans, the Apostle Paul makes a very logical and systematic argument that both Jews and Gentiles are under God's condemnation. The Apostle Paul argues that apart from Christ, one is under the wrath of God, and it is within the context that Paul provides us with an understanding or teaching of what we often call general revelation. What do theologians mean by the term general revelation?
It's a great question, Paul. Definitions are important. So we've got 2 terms. I'll make it really simple by doing the second term first. So the second term is revelation. This just deals with God revealing himself, and we discover in Scripture that there are several ways that he does that. The first term is general, and we would contrast that with special. So it has to do with the audience. Who is he revealing this to? And it also has to do with the content of that revelation. So we find there's general revelation, there's special revelation, there's even personal revelation in the sense that Jesus came as a person revealing the Father. That's what I mean by personal revelation. General revelation, it refers to how God has revealed himself generally to all of humanity. And that's what Paul is talking about, especially in Romans 1:20. He says, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, number 1, his eternal power, number 2, and his divine nature, number 3, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. So God has revealed himself generally to all, something that's universal, everyone not only has access to, but is accountable for.
And that's going to be part of Paul's argument as he gives us the bad news before he gives us the good news. Well, Pastor Armstrong, in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 to 20, we read, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. From this passage, what do we learn about one source of general revelation about God?
Yeah, it's a great verse. It states that God is visible in creation. His invisible attributes are clearly seen through what he's created. When God created the universe, all that we see with our eye, it points to him. It shows us that there is a powerful God. We see design and order in the cosmos, in the universe. And so that should tell us, and God says it's evident within us, that there is a creator behind this creation that we see. You look out in the universe and you come to the conclusion that there has to be a designer, because there's so much design in every part of creation that we can see, that we all have equal access to.
I love the illustration of William Paley, the watchmaker. He said in the following way, basically when you discover a watch, you don't assume that it just fell out of the air, that just came out of nowhere, right? He goes on to say several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served it by. When we see a watch, it's obvious to us that watch had a maker who formed it for the purpose of telling time. God's revealed himself to every single person born in this world. We're all accountable to God through creation that points to a creator. We're all without excuse. That's one form of general revelation. Well, Dr. Cohn, in Romans 2, the Apostle Paul discusses a second form of general revelation. General revelation is that which is available to every single human being born into this world. In Romans 2, verses 14 to 15, we read, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them." Would you please explain the context of this verse, and then what this verse tells us about this form of general revelation known as the moral law? We might use different terminology, but this concept here.
Yeah, so Paul gets into this incredible discussion of law in Romans throughout the letter and also in Galatians. It's a pretty significant grounding point of a human relationship with God. And in Romans in particular, we'll discover that sometimes Paul refers to the law, that definite article, the word the, and other times he leaves it out. And usually when he includes the definite article, he's referring to the law of Moses, capital L, the Mosaic law that Israel was under, given by God through Moses. And other times we'll see that Paul will use the term law in a more general sense, particularly in relation to the Gentiles, and it will refer to, I would use the word ethics, and I like how you use the word moral law. Every culture and society has some concept of a moral law or an ethical system, and Paul often talks in these contexts about the law of Moses. In this particular passage, Romans 2:14 and 15, what we discover is that the Gentiles who did not have the Mosaic law, the law that God gave to Israel, they weren't accountable for that, but they're instinctively doing things of that law because they had a concept and understanding of right and wrong. So we have this innate understanding and awareness as part of general revelation that we all understand this aspect of God, that there's right and wrong, there's accountability to a creator. The Jewish audience of the letter to the Romans would be very aware of their responsibility under the Mosaic law, the law, capital L, where Paul is explaining here that the Gentiles who didn't have that responsibility or accountability, they had law in the sense of ethics in general. It became a law unto themselves so that they're demonstrating that even those who didn't have that particular law code still have an understanding of right and wrong. Whether we call it moral law or ethics, every culture, every society, every individual has a concept of right and wrong. And the question is, where'd that come from?
Right.
You've described it as an aspect of general revelation. I think that's very appropriate. It's an internal thing. It's there. We can't get rid of it, even if we turn our back on it.
And I would just add that that's great that we can know that every person that we come in contact with, despite what they say they believe, we know that God has said he has made himself evident to them. So we can talk to them from that perspective, I think, and in a loving way. But to deny that, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, because it is foolish. God has revealed clearly, it says, within us, moral conscience that God has placed there. There's a God. There's a sovereign creator of all that we see. And so we do have that culpability.
Yeah, and if there is moral law, if there is ethics, then someone had to create that. And of course, that's an intelligent designer who knows what's best for humanity. And we all agree. Even atheists say Hitler is evil, Stalin's evil. Well, a lot of people in the world today say Putin's evil. We recognize that certain things are bad. The atheistic worldview can't answer that question, right? They want to say that that's bad, but their worldview doesn't allow them to, really. They have to say the murderer, the rapist, Hitler, they're all just functioning naturally. Professor Oglesby, the Apostle Paul provided a very systematic treatment here, doesn't he? All Gentiles are condemned before God and are under God's wrath due to these two forms of general revelation. In chapter 2, verses 17 to 29, Paul argues that in addition to the general revelation that's available to all humanity, Jews and Gentiles alike, the Jewish people also have special revelation that condemns them. First, please explain what special revelation is. We've talked about it a little bit, but maybe you want to elaborate on that. And then what is Paul mentioning here? What kind of special revelations is he referring to?
Like discussed earlier, revelation is that unveiling, that revealing of information or knowledge that God has given. Oftentimes what we see as special revelation commonly would be, well, Scripture, that's special revelation, right? God has revealed great detail. He's revealed something specific and special in that sense. And as earlier we've mentioned a little bit about visions and dreams and things of that nature being specific and special revelation given to a special audience. And I think too, in this context, as it's dealing with the Jews, we see in verse 17, but if you bear the name Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God, when we look at the law, how was the law revealed? It was revealed in a very special case where God gives that to Moses. We see that in Exodus, an account in Leviticus, a little bit of Numbers, and a recount in Deuteronomy. God giving the law in a very specific and special way. And in fact, I think if we go on a little bit past this section, in the first 2 verses of chapter 3, we see a little bit more about this as well. It says, then what advantage has the Jew, or what's the benefit of circumcision? Great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. If you look at that word for oracles, it really is pointing to the idea of God telling the sayings of God. Those things that God has given, has revealed, the knowledge he has given in a very special, specific way to a special and specific audience.
Dr. Cohn, how does Paul argue that this special revelation given to the Jewish people condemned the Jewish people?
He's expressing that they have been given the law, what we understand to be 613 commandments. The people of Israel weren't able to follow that law because, as Paul explains in Romans, that law is never given to provide righteousness or to provide a solution for the unrighteousness that we all have. It was designed to show how much we need God's righteousness. And so Paul will argue that the Jewish person has special communication from God, and it's specifically related to this law that was revealed through Moses, and God holds them accountable for that knowledge and information.
Professor Oglesby, aren't these arguments of natural revelation or general revelation that's given to every person born into this world, that being creation around us and the moral law within us, aren't these also the strongest arguments even used today amongst many apologists?
They certainly have their strengths, right? We see the cosmological argument. We're looking at like the teleological argument, the argument from design. You look out at the world and it's clear there's a designer. Everything's been designed. And so there has to be a designer for that. Order coming out of chaos is untenable. It leads you to a point where you have to acknowledge the existence of a supreme being, someone above us. There is a designer. The shortcoming, I think, and the difficulty that we have to overcome there is that it's general, just like we see in general revelation. And so you come to the end and the question is, okay, I can acknowledge that yes, there's a designer because I can't get around that. I can't avoid that. Now, who is it? And then I think that's where special revelation comes into play. You go, well, let me tell you who that is. You can use these arguments to get them thinking that direction. Mm-hmm. For an atheist to go to theism is a really big step. You get there and then you go, well, let me tell you more about who designed the world, who designed the universe. I can give you more information revelation about him. It's a great conversation starter. It's a massive first step if someone can acknowledge that, yeah, there has to be a deity. I can't get around theism at the very least. Now let's keep working in the right direction.
Great point. And in our conference this weekend, we referenced a man by the name of Anthony Flew, didn't we? Anthony Flew is one of the most well-known atheists before the so-called new atheists, right? The very angry, vitriolic, emotional arguments of Richard Dawkins, who wrote God Delusion, and Anthony Hitchinson that wrote God is Not Great. These very angry atheists, but before that generation of angry atheists, there was Anthony Flew, who was we might call a genuine liberal, right? He was genuinely seeking truth in 2004, near the end of his life, in a series of conversations with Gary Habermas, one of the most well-known apologists in the field of the resurrection. And through various dialogues and conversations, Anthony Flew wrote a book that I have on my shelf. It's entitled, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And in 2004, he wrote in his book, I had to go where the evidence leads. And it was the intelligent design. It was looking at creation that points to creator that led this atheist to that step of theist. But that's only the first step, right? There's that next step that's necessary to understand that special revelation about the person of Jesus. General revelation's helpful to a point. We want to answer the questions of genuine seekers, don't we? But the gospel, as he says in Romans 1:16 and 17, is the power of salvation. Whether or not they accept Bible as the word of God, we can still go to it and share the truth of it, and even use our personal experience and share how God has changed our lives through the gospel. Well, Pastor Armstrong, so we have been investigating the teaching, the biblical theology of revelation from Romans 1 and 2. Let's now turn our attention to wrath. Not such a favorite topic of most. The two are inseparable, though. The revelation of God leads to man's condemnation, Jews and Gentiles alike, and the condemnation of mankind points to the wrath of God. In Romans 1:18 we read, For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress truth in unrighteousness. Would you please explain the teaching of God's wrath recorded here in Romans 1 and 2?
The way I understand that verse and the teaching of the wrath of God is that it is being revealed, that it's in the present tense, and that it's clearly being revealed in those who are suppressing the truth in ungodliness and unrighteousness. I understand that it's meaning the wrath of God is being revealed through God giving those who continue to want to pursue sin and the things that they desire, the fleshly desires that they have. God it gives them over at some point and says, fine, if this is what you believe you want to indulge in this sinful behavior, have at it, and sin begets more sin, as we've learned this weekend especially. So when someone suppresses the truth they know about God and decide rather to then indulge in the flesh and what their passions, their desires, and Romans 1 talks about different examples of that, then God gives them over and continue to sin, and sin begets more sin. And so I think it just piles up in their life, and that is God's wrath being revealed against them. And I think there's a point in time, which we don't know when that point in time would be, where God gives them over to a debased mind. And that's my understanding of the wrath of God being revealed, is that you see it everywhere. You see people living out their sinful desires and lifestyles and things that God has forbidden and said we shouldn't indulge in. They are out there indulging in it without any real remorse. And they also want the rest of society to not just accept these sinful lifestyles. They want them to endorse them and become very anti-God, anti-morality in their lifestyle. And I think that's an evidence of someone being given over to the wrath of God because of the rejection of God and the light that he's given them.
Paul says 3 times in verse 24, 26, and 28 that God gave them over. God gave them over to impurity. God gave them over to homosexuality. And God gave them over to a depraved mind. And he gives quite an extensive list there of results of that. And of course, this really hits on the LGBTQ issue, doesn't it? Where Paul says in Romans 1:26, it's shameful, natural, indecent, perversion. So 4 different times. And it seems to be an example or illustration of going against everything that's natural in God's order and plan. And certainly there could have been other things that Paul included in this list, but he does give quite attention to this issue of men with men and women with women being unnatural, shameful, indecent, perversion. Any thoughts about that?
You know, Paul is walking us down this progression of denying the designer. And when you deny the designer, it's inevitable that you have to try to deny the design. As Gary put it earlier, the fingerprints of God. The problem that we have is we've suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. We've denied the designer, and so as we try to make sense of our experience in life, we have to take these steps to get rid of the fingerprints of God. Otherwise, we are confronted constantly with absurdity of our position. While it's certainly true that not every person that struggles with that particular choice or that particular situation, homosexuality, it is true that that is part of the progression of rejecting the design of male and female and how God designed them, the fingerprints of God in gender. And we've taken it a step further. It's a tremendous thing in our culture today, a tremendous issue, the whole gender identity aspect. We're trying to remove any definition designed from the designer so that we are no longer accountable to that designer. And so it's really a heartbreaking thing because we are not certain of our identity. We often then fall into these kind of cultural and societal definitions for us. And so we have a message of hope and love and truth. Even as we're talking about the wrath of God being revealed, He's telling us this to provide hope and an answer. And that's really encouraging.
So he's really setting the stage for what's to come in chapter 3 and beyond that tells us there's good news, right? We're still in the bad news part, right? We're talking about society as a whole and individuals on a personal level who God gives them over to their own sin. Sin, as Pastor Armstrong said, God gives us over to our own sin. God gave them over to impurity, God gave them over to homosexuality, and God gave them over to a depraved mind. So we see some of that outworking in society in general, and certainly in our Western American society, the depraved way of thinking that really has become a lot more evident to us more recently. I think of C.S. Lewis's quote, he wrote The Abolition of Man, and we actually have a podcast on this book, and I highly recommend it, but he's really prophetic in talking about you rip away the morality, and it's going to result in the abolition or destruction of society if you try to rip away the moral fabric that God has given us. And Lewis in Abolition of Man says, we remove the organ, or the heart, demand the function. We remove the organ, demand the function. We make men without chests, he's saying without hearts, without morality, and expect of them virtue. We laugh at honor. We laugh at why would you go to the military and fight for your country? That's a waste of your life. But are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful.
I think it's interesting, too, specifically here as it's talking about the unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. You would think, as you had mentioned earlier, that as you suppress that truth that's so evident, you would expect actions to be based on falsehood, right? If you're going to actively suppress the truth. I love C.S. Lewis's quote that you had just mentioned about ripping away morality. I think even more foundational to taking away the morality is taking away the person who gives us that morality, right? You take away the existence of God by suppressing that truth. Depravity should be expected there.
Paul's developing a strong argument that everyone in this world who refuse to accept the truth that's available to them, suppress it, are under God's wrath. And Dr. Sperlin, many branches of what we might call liberal theology, or those that do not accept the Bible as the inspired and inerrant word, we're not talking politics, but we're talking theologically liberal, they hate the idea of wrath. They're wrathful, we could say, regarding the doctrine of God's wrath. Why is that the case?
Well, this is the moment that your listeners have been waiting for. They've been wondering what happened to that other guy. I am that other guy. But if you'd allow me, again, with maybe an illustration. When I was a child, here's how it would work with me, especially at church, because that's usually where I got in trouble. And Dad sitting in the choir and seeing me goofing off, he would give me the look. I knew what was coming. When we got home, I would rush to my bedroom and find the flimsiest little belt I could find, the one that hurt the least, and maybe even go so far as to put on a few pair of extra underwear and maybe some shorts or something like that. And I would do anything that I could to lessen the impact of the judgment and the wrath to come. I see the same thing happening with liberal theologians. Paul has just finished wrapping up everybody basically in the same wrapper that we're all under sin. So he says that in Romans 3, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so therefore he's placed us all under the wrath of God. With the suppression, we've rejected the designer. Part of the designer's makeup is that he's just, he's righteous, and he's going to judge sin. Well, who wants to hear that message, right?
Right.
Nobody wants to hear that message. So they're in their bedroom finding the smallest belt and putting on the extra undergarments and they're suppressing the truth. They don't want to know about it. There are passages in the Bible that say, well, God is love, God is merciful, and God is long-suffering. Therefore, when I remove that aspect of God as being a wrathful God against sin, then all I'm left with is my version, God is love. I go back to who wouldn't hate the idea that I'm going to get something I deserve. It's not going to be something that I like. To suppress that truth, I just get rid of the wrath of God.
As mentioned, this concept of love, this is favorite doctrine of those coming from a liberal persuasion, and wrath is, again, hated, despised by liberal theologians because they don't think it fits with what God should be in their estimation. Professor Oglesby, we cannot truly understand the love of God, the overwhelming, the unrelenting love of God, if we do not understand this doctrine of wrath. Would you explain?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think with liberal theologians, there's a wrong definition of love. And I think that definition of love is missing the wrath. And what I mean by that is, in order for me to understand, truly understand God's love and grace and compassion, I have to understand the wrath. But in order to really fully understand the wrath and appreciate the wrath, I need to understand God's holiness. And when I get that picture, the best I can, then let it stand on its own. And then I jump into the following chapters in Romans, and I see the result of what God has done to satisfy that wrath. Now I can more fully understand truly what God's love is, the care and compassion He has for the well-being of others.
So we can't make God into our own image or how we want Him to be, right? We need to go where the Bible leads us. The Bible teaches both the wrath of God and the love of God.
I think that's one of my biggest heartbreaks, honestly, when we look at liberal theology and what's been posited. Because if I understand the wrath of God and what He's done out of His love for us, Jesus died for the whole world. God loved us in this manner. John 3:16, of course, that He sent His only Son to die, and He's a propitiation, as John later tells us in 1 John, satisfaction of that wrath. That is so much more powerful than the definition of love we've been given in society and amongst liberal theologies that's been provided us. It's really heartbreaking.
Dr. Sperlin, in next week's episode, we get to talk about a fun subject, a subject that builds upon the wrath of God. We're going to continue our discussion on the biblical theology of Romans, specifically the doctrine of justification. As we wrap up today's podcast, please explain how Paul's arguments in Romans 1-3, here on general revelation, special revelation, and God's wrath, set the stage for his teaching on justification.
A few years ago, I had a discussion with Robert Leitner of Dallas Seminary, and we're talking about sharing the gospel, evangelism. I always remember what he said. He said, you got to get them lost before you can get them saved. In a nutshell, what Paul has done in Romans 1-3, he's made it clear that it's the Gentiles, although they had no system of law, they had an ethical principle that they knew innately. And then he also gets down to the Jewish audience that, yeah, you have the law, but you break the law. And if you break any aspect of the law, you've broken the whole thing. And so he's really wrapped us all up in the same blanket.
Yeah.
That we're all under sin, and we all need some way out. And he's going to make it clear that there's no way out on our own, but that God has made the way because He is a gracious, loving God, and the Lord Jesus Christ is the one who purchased our way out.
And that's a great way to end our conversation as we ruminate and contemplate the revelation that God's given and the wrath that results from the suppression of that truth. But tune in next week, and we'll talk about this great teaching on justification. To our listeners, I hope that you will join us again next week as we continue our discussion on the biblical theology of Romans. We will indeed discuss the incredible teaching known as justification. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, would you please help us get the word out by sharing this podcast on your social media platforms and liking this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Please also leave us a positive review. This will help our podcast become more visible and accessible to those who are seeking faith-building programming. Well, until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you believe determines how you behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, theologymatters.com.